Good night, horror lovers. Welcome to the night of terror, where darkness is coming and your nightmare has just begun. Camping alone. It always sounds like a good idea when you're far from the woods, sitting in your living room, imagining the peace, the solitude. But when night falls and the only sounds are the whispers of the trees, it becomes something different. This is the story of James Thompson, a 32-year-old man who decided to escape the hustle and bustle of his city life for a weekend. He chose a spot deep in the forests of the Appalachian Mountains, a place he'd heard about from a coworker, a secret location where no one would disturb him. The kind of place that seemed untouched by civilization. But sometimes solitude comes with a cost, and in the dead of night, the woods, they have their own rules. It was around 7 p.m. when James arrived at the site. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, fresh, and the only company he had were the distant chirps of birds preparing for nightfall. He pitched his tent near a small clearing by a creek, feeling at peace, far away from the noise of the city. He loved being alone. It was where he could think, clear his mind, or so he thought. "This is exactly what I needed," James said. But as the fire began to die down, and the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the forest changed. The once comforting sounds of nature became unfamiliar. The wind felt colder, sharper. The trees that had seemed welcoming just hours before now loomed dark and indifferent. James whispering, startled. What was that? James sat up, peering into the trees. The fire was nearly out, casting faint, flickering shadows around him. His mind tried to rationalize it. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But something felt off. The snap hadn't come from the underbrush where small animals would be. It had come from above, as if someone or something had stepped on a branch hanging in the trees. He reached for his flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark, but the woods seemed to swallow it whole. His heart began to race, each breath shallow. He scanned the trees but saw nothing, just endless darkness and the faint outlines of branches swaying in the wind. James said, "Calm down, it's just the forest. Nothing out there but animals." But deep down he wasn't so sure. Something felt wrong, as if he were being watched. Deciding to check the area, James stepped away from his tent, shining the flashlight into the forest. The beam of light flickered slightly, an old battery maybe, or something else. He scanned the perimeter, the silence pressing in on him. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, standing at the edge of the trees, unmoving. James froze. His flashlight hovered over the figure. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Just like that, the shadow vanished into the trees, without a sound. His heart pounded harder now, a sinking feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. James, whispering, "I saw something. I know I did." He wanted to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that the shadows were nothing more than the branches moving in the breeze. But deep down, he knew. Something was out there. Returning to the fire, James tried to calm himself. He stoked the flames, hoping the light would chase away whatever fear had settled in his bones. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. And then, the whispering began. James, startled, looking around. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was faint, almost inaudible. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from the trees. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to him, beckoning him deeper. But James wasn't foolish enough to follow the sound. Not yet. The footsteps were closer now, unmistakable. They circled the campsite, slow, deliberate. James stood up, gripping his flashlight tightly, swinging it wildly through the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the sound of something just out of sight. James breathing heavily on edge. "Who's out there?" Silence. No reply. The whispering had stopped, the footsteps ceased. But the air was thick with tension and James knew he wasn't alone. Suddenly, a scraping sound came from the side of his tent, like something brushing against the fabric. James spun around, shining the flashlight at the tent. Nothing. But then, he saw them. Deep scratches, claw marks, cutting through the material of the tent, marks that hadn't been there before. James panicked, whispering to himself, "This can't be happening." His mind raced. Should he run? Should he stay? Every fiber of his being screamed to leave, to abandon the tent, the fire, and flee into the night. But something held him there. Fear, confusion, or maybe something darker. The snap was close, too close. Whatever was out there, it was no longer playing games. It was hunting him. James, frantic, "I've got to get out of here." Without thinking, James began packing his gear, fumbling with the zippers and straps. He had to leave now. The woods had become hostile, and staying meant risking more than just a sleepless night. He ran through the trees, past the creek, deeper into the forest. His flashlight bounced in his hand, casting wild shadows around him. Every step felt like something was right behind him, just out of reach. The whispering returned, louder now, clearer. It was no longer just the wind, it was a voice, and it was calling his name. Voice whispering, "James, James." He stumbled, falling to the ground, his flashlight flying from his hand. Darkness swallowed him, but even as he scrambled to get up, the voice grew louder, closer. Voice, "James?" Something was coming. Something was after him. He could feel it, feel the weight of its presence in the air. James grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the trees. And that's when he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the light, tall and twisted, with eyes that glowed in the dark. It smiled, a smile that wasn't human, a smile that belonged to something ancient, something hungry. James, screaming in terror, "No, stay away!" The woods fell silent, no footsteps, no whispers, no wind, just the overwhelming silence, thick and oppressive. James lay on the forest floor, his body trembling. He couldn't hear it anymore, couldn't see it, but he knew it was still there, watching, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe hours. He couldn't tell. The darkness had consumed everything. The flashlight flickered once, then went out. James felt a cold sweat drip down his back. His body ached, his mind raced. What was it? What had he seen? Was it real? Or was he losing his grip on reality? Then, just as he gathered the courage to stand, there it was again. The soft rustling of leaves, so faint it could have been his imagination. But it wasn't. He stood up slowly, scanning the darkness with wide eyes. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned back toward the campsite. Maybe, if he could just make it back to the tent, he could grab his phone, call for help, do something, anything to get out of this nightmare. As James took a step, the footsteps echoed his movement. Closer, deliberate. It was no longer pretending to be distant. It wanted him to know it was there. "James," whispering terrified, "please, just let me go." But the woods don't bargain. They don't listen to please. They only take. James broke into a run again, the branches tearing at his skin, the cold air burning in his lungs. Every direction looked the same. Dark trees, endless paths, no escape. He was lost in the maze of the forest, and the thing chasing him, it was closing in. It was behind him, moving through the woods with unnatural speed, almost gliding over the ground. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried, it was always just behind him. Always just out of reach. But not for long. James fell again, crashing to the ground. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, stunned, the world spinning, and then he heard it. A low, guttural breathing, right above him. James slowly turned his head, dread filling every part of his body, and there it was. The figure from the woods, standing over him, tall, shadowed, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its face twisted, a grotesque mockery of a smile spreading across its features. Voice low, inhuman, whispering, "James, James," crying out in terror. voice breaking, "Leave me alone." But it was too late. The forest erupted with the whispers, louder now, surrounding him from every direction. They weren't just voices, they were calling him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. James tried to crawl away, but the figure stepped closer, reaching out with long, spindly fingers. The air grew colder, the night darker, as if the forest itself was closing in around him. Voice distorted, echoing, "You are mine." And with that final chilling whisper, the woods consumed him. The figure faded into the trees, the whispers quieted, and the night returned to its usual, eerie stillness. The next morning, park rangers found the campsite, but there was no sign of James. His tent was torn apart, his belongings scattered, but no footprints led away from the site. It was as if he had simply vanished. They searched the area for days, but the forest held its secrets tightly. James Thompson was never seen again. Sometimes people disappear in the woods. The forest swallows them whole, leaving nothing but whispers behind. And sometimes if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear their voices, calling for help, calling for company. But no one ever answers, because once the woods take you, you're never truly alone again. So if you ever find yourself camping alone at night and you hear something just beyond the trees, remember this: you're not alone. The forest is watching, always watching, and sometimes it's hungry.
That's it for tonight's horror story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next horror story. Thank you.